Singapore is seeing its biggest electoral race since 1972, with 82 out of 87 parliamentary seats being contested. With more young voters going to the polls for the first time and the opposition fielding candidates with better qualifications, some observers expect a tough and close fight between the People's Action Party and the opposition. A panel discussion organised by Singapore Press Club titled General Election 2011, What Has Changed? And chaired by Singapore Press Holdings Editor-in-Chief of English and Malay newspapers, Mr. Patrick Daniel, shed light on what makes this election a potentially landmark one.
One of the things that we have seen in recent years is that, unfortunately, the Singapore electorate, Singapore population, has actually become much more partisan than before, much more polarized. So if you're an opposition supporter, they've become real hardcore opposition supporters. If they're PAP supporters, they're strong PAP supporters. And the divide between those two groups is really quite deep.
The four panelists were Associate Professor Cherian George of the Wee Kim Wee School of Communication and Information, former Editor-in-Chief of the Straits Times Peter Lim, Capital Land's Group Communications Director Bhaskaran Nair, and former anchorman Melvin Yong. They expressed their surprise at the number of former civil servants and ex-scholars who have joined the opposition.
I'm very, very surprised. I thought they would do it post-Lee Kuan Yew. That was the first impression I had, and not so early.
Some of the individuals that you now see joining the opposition, I would have easily pictured them joining something like the Round Table in the early in the 1990s. So the big question is, why are these same kinds of characters going all the way and joining opposition instead? So my hunch is that this has to do with the fact that that middle ground, that non-partisan but politically engaged middle ground, has been squeezed by mainly, I think, by a sense of cynicism that is not irrational. It arises from the fact that the government has been, in a sense, has become more dogmatic, I think, since the 1990s.
Other panelists also pointed out how the popularity of social media has contributed to greater interest in this election among Singaporeans.
What is clear this time is that social media is keeping up that news value a little bit more. It's somewhat setting the agenda in many cases on issues about maybe even ministerial pay. It's not something that traditional media has done a lot, but you see a lot of that in social media.
All kinds of reasons can be given, including justifiable attribution to the new technology, to the social media. But the tide has changed. You will not go back.
The panelists said PAP's vote share is likely to see a dip of between 5 and 10% come May 7. But most also said the PAP is likely to make a clean sweep in terms of parliamentary seats.
My rough feel is that the people's heart is for the opposition, but the people's mind is for the PAP. I still think that the PAP will have a clean sweep of these elections, although the percentage will drop tremendously. Part of the reason is because I think 87-0.
And you heard it here first.
Yeah. However, main reason is because I think the new citizens have actually provided a base support for the PAP. Although the Singaporeans, by and large, Singapore-born Singaporeans have actually moved towards the opposition itself. It's a 5% swing.
Former news anchor Melvin Yong, on the other hand, predicted that the PAP will win 82 out of the 87 parliamentary seats, and he reasoned that this is a likely scenario as more young voters are going to the poll.
It's really a generational change. I mean, you talk about baby boomer. I think I'm Gen X,
64,
right? So I'm Gen X, which is the next generation, not too far away. That generation would somewhat speak up, but then would still be somewhat God-fearing, if you like. PAP fearing, but I think no longer with Gen Y and after. You see young people these days, they're happy to speak up, they're happy to ask questions, they challenge you. Whatever you say, they ask you to rationalize why you say that. So it's very much being translated into the electorate now. I mean, we all know the numbers, right? 1 in 2 voters now is a young voter. So half the electorate is that generation.
More worryingly, former Straits Times columnist Sharon George said this could be one election that will end with no sense of closure.
This has been a good campaign by any measure. If this were a theatre production, it would win a Life Theatre Award. Right? My worry, though, is that even though this has been a good campaign, it may not be remembered as a good election. And the reason is that to be a good election, there needs to be, I think, a sense of closure. And I fear that there are a couple of scenarios in which this election would fail to provide that sense of closure. The first scenario, which I think is entirely plausible, is an 86-1 victory for the PAP. Maybe even 86-0, but I don't think that's so plausible. 86-1 would not be too troubling if it came on the back of, say, a 65% vote share for the PAP. Because there have been at least 3 elections in the last 20 years where we've had roughly 1 or 2 members elected on the back of roughly 65% vote share for the PAP. So nothing new there. But if, as many people suspect, the vote share is going to dip below a sort of psychological threshold of 60%, if it's going to be, say, 55, 56%, and there's only one opposition member of parliament, I think there will be deep unhappiness that this is not quite the way it's supposed to be. Right? This is a bad scenario because I think the PAP would then have to spend the following years doing exactly what it hates. It would have to defend the political system against endless complaints, I think justified complaints from Singaporeans, instead of getting on with the job of government. The other scenario that would also, I think, fail to provide much of a sense of closure would be the opposite. If there were a significant opposition inroads at the expense of ministers that we want to see continue in government.
Stay tuned for our coverage on polling day.